Okay, today's topic, as you saw at the very beginning, right? We're talking about the funding of jihad, global jihad, and how it comes about. And as far as I'm concerned, the first thing we need to do is go to Wahhabism. That is the essence of jihad. And there are three principles of it. Now, Wahhabism comes out of the Arabian Peninsula. Next slide, we'll get into it a bit more. But just to remember, and it's actually very, very simple, that there are three major principles. One, you have allegiance to Allah. Two, to Islam. And three, to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what does that mean in essence? It means this. Allah, okay, one God, very monotheistic. Islam, it means everything that's written in the Quran. And as we know, there's some pretty tough things written there. There are also lots of contradictions. And the Prophet Muhammad, meaning his lifestyle, everything that he did. He fought 80 some odd battles, skirmishes, whatever. But beyond that, he had something like 27 of those battles were very serious attacks, very serious clashes, and some of them quite brutal towards the adversaries, the enemies. Okay, and they say you could never change it. So it's this very, very strict understanding of the creed, the first believers that there were. You can have no interpretations or reinterpretations. Everything is totally fundamentalist. In other words, as harsh as one can be. Okay, we have a picture on the side there from an archives of when the founder of Wahhabism actually wrote this up. Okay, so moving along, and here you have a map of Arabia, right? The Wahhab-Saudi alliance, which is of great significance because we always thought of Saudi Arabia as pro-West. Now, nowadays, it's more pro-West than it had been previously. But let's take a look at this and how it made its way forward into the 21st century, actually. First of all, Wahhabist conquests were always totally brutal. The whole issue of martyrdom, jihad, terror, subjugating other tribes, enemies, forcing people who are Muslims already to convert to the Wahhabist idea, meaning that there's a lot of slaughter. Now, this arises in the mid-1700s in northeast Arabia, but the terrorism there, and it's real terrorism, makes its way throughout the peninsula and all the way down to Mecca and Medina as well. When does it catch everybody's attention? We're talking in a period of the early period of it is under the Ottoman Empire. There are attacks against Iraq and Syria. Now, in particular against the Shiites, right? Just like the Islamic State Caliphate of a few years ago, and believe me, they'll be back. Their greatest hatreds for the Shiites, you had the roots of that with Wahhabism. Now, the Ottomans failed in putting it down. They had to call on the Egyptians. It's a very interesting part of the history. Those who were in the course that we have, it's in a couple of the classes it gets mentioned. And where was the deal made? That the Sauds made an alliance with the Wahhabists. The Wahhabists were up front. They destroyed Karbala in 1802 as a Shiite shrine, large city. And in this alliance, in the Hejaz, the western part of Saudi Arabia, both of them actually take over these areas, as we said, Mecca and Medina. In the end, after the Egyptians get involved, the Ottomans capture the leadership here, execute quite a few of them, and then force them back into the middle of the Arabian Peninsula where they came from. Why is this so important? Because when Saudi Arabia finally becomes a nation state in the 1920s, the Sauds who lead it on the outside, they are pro-Western and they guarantee oil and all that. There's an agreement between Roosevelt and Abdulaziz ibn Saud in the 1930s. But it's the Wahhabists who control the domestic agenda, meaning education, laws, you name it. Now, as of 2017, and this is where it's really important, Mohammed bin Salman, right, that young leader is maybe he's about, I think he's just about 40 years old now. He shifts more towards the West, not just foreign policy and defense, but also internally starts having reforms like women are allowed to drive. and vote and whatever else. And that sounds a little ridiculous to us as a reform, but you have to remember it's extremely, extremely harsh conservative society in that way, reactionary, I would say. Okay, now I talked about Qataris, right? Qatar was part of the Arabian Peninsula. What has happened is that Qatar got its independence, but it has remained Wahhabist to this day, and the leadership is very proud of that. So I'm going to go through a few statistics here, if you understand things. First of all, Qatar has revenues, GDP, as we call it, 2024, about $230 billion. Doesn't sound like a hell of a lot, but the whole population is only 3.1 million. But close to 90% of that population they are foreign workers. In other words, you have something like 12% or so of the population that are actually native Qataris, meaning some 350, 60,000 nationals. Hamid bin Khalifa Al Thani, he was, in 1995, he is the Amir who really puts together this activism that you'll have on Qatar. He's very, very proud. He makes it clear all the time. His great pride in saying, I'm a Wahhabist. I come from the family of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And these are my people. This is the way we run things. The Wahhabists are my family. It's not like he's trying to hide anything. And we know that. The jihadis don't try to hide it. They put it right in your face. And of course, people in the West say, oh, they don't really mean it. They're posturing. They want something else. They want to be part of the markets. They have plenty of markets here. They don't have to worry about that. They became, already in the 90s, very much allies of the Americans and of the West, what's called a major non-NATO ally. And that's signed on by the previous president, United States, Joe Biden, who's continuing a policy that was rooted in developing the air base in Qatar that was established already in the 1990s by CENTCOM. Okay, so they're playing a double game here. They're very Wahhabist on the inside, but on the outside, yes, we're cooperating as much as possible with the West. By the way, the Saudis were doing the same thing at that time. Like I said, 2017, that would begin to shift. Okay, and they make sure that they invest lots of their money and leverage it for economic reasons. Make more money, of course, spreading the wealth, right? Not just keeping it oil and gas and whatever, which actually was very, very intelligent things to do. But they're invested in real estate, banks, airports, Heathrow, for instance. And as we know, sports. Where did Qatar get a big name recently in 2022? In hosting the Soccer World Cup, right? Just a couple of years ago, right? So this double game, the modern high tech, right? Their economy, the education, and integrating into the capitalist world. But they're very Wahhabist, and they project their influence that way. In other words, they are using this extremism, right? It will be funneled through their influence throughout the world. And of course, we'll see most of that when we're speaking about education. So traditional Saudi policies, balance between Wahhabism and the West. Like we said, Saudi Arabia isn't quite there anymore. They've shifted over, call it more liberal, even though compared to, of course, liberal societies, it's not there yet. Okay, then his son, Amir Tamim bin Hamid, overthrows his father in 2013. So his father's in power for 18 years, and now he's been in power. I guess this is about 11, 12 years now. Right? It's a palace coup. Nothing earth-shattering. And he makes sure, continues with the full Sharia law, Muslim Brotherhood, the education system, hailing martyrdom and jihad. For those in the course, and for people who not, right, there's this great ideologue, theologian, I should say, Said Qutb, who believed in world jihad, and he's the most influential, powerful cleric, if you want, of the mid-20th century. And He has vicious anti-Semitic, anti-Western, anti-democratic writings. And these are fully adopted by Amir Tamim bin Hamid. Right? Also, who comes afterwards? Yusuf Qaradawi, who fully advocates jihad and towards Jews, not just jihad, but destruction, extermination, because he speaks of the jihad as finishing Hitler's work, which, by the way, he borrows from Said Qutb, who has a whole essay on the struggle or the jihad against the Jews. So this two-faced policy towards the West of integration and soft power jihad conquest, because Qatar is far too small. I think all their security forces together is 12,000 strong, which is nothing. All right. And a small population that benefits from all this. Remember, the foreign workers aren't gaining from Qatari well-being, their GDP. So let's take a look at what they do and how they funnel money into jihadi groups. I'm going to give an example. In 2014, as the Islamic State Caliphate was rising, if you remember, right, they captured Mosul at the end of June. But you also have affiliate groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which, by the way, Julani that you've heard about, right, Ahmed al-Shara, who rules in Syria today, he was the leader of the al-Nusra Front in those days. They took Fiji UN troops hostage. I remember it very well. Okay, it was like being filmed live. Okay, these troops were taken hostage. The UN, they couldn't fight their way out. And in the end, the Qataris come along, pay the $25 million ransom to free them. Everybody was quite happy. But some people began to ask questions. Wait a minute. Why give them so much money? Okay. When does it really blow up in everyone's face? 2017. There's a whole series of different hostage crises. The Qataris actually pay somewhere around $1 billion to the Sunni Tahrir al-Sham, right? That's the same group that just captured Syria today, as well as even funding Shiite jihadis to free hostages. That's when the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Sauds, Bahrain, and everybody else, there are a whole bunch that say, break relations with them. They are paying as much as they can in order to ensure that these groups get money. Because they would say, oh, everybody would complain, it's illegal, you give them money, right? Illegal, or you're supporting jihad. They say, no, we're just freeing hostages. But it's so overdone, the amounts paid, and then they realize, it's realized in the Arab world, the West, oh, the hostages are free, or this, that, and the other, okay? Now, after this break with the Sunni Arab world, you have full Iranian support, and they begin to build the alliance. In other words, the alliance wasn't there so much beforehand, because there were always issues with Shiites, so they began to move in that direction. Now, the Sauds, interesting enough, they wanted to invade Qatar and put an end to this. Now, it was the beginning of Trump's first administration, and he said no. Now, call it lack of experience. I don't know what he would do today, but he forbade it. And once again, at the beginning of a term, a new president could say, listen, wait. This is not the way to go about things. In any case, we've sort of suffered since then, because Qatar has become much more powerful in this, call it this soft projection of power. And by the way, diplomatic relations were restored a few years later, and they shift much of their focus to the West, which, by the way, they had started doing already around 2010, 2012. So this jihad conflict mediation, funding Islamic extremism, that's how I put it up here, all right? They support Hamas, undercut all the moderate Arab states who, were boycotting them. And it continues. And we've seen it recently, not only negotiation of all these prisoner deals, but they're brokering between Israel and Hamas today. You should know, Syria has no money. They're bankrupt. Who's paying the salaries there of Ashara, right? From Jabhat al-Nusra, previously al-Julani. The Qataris, they pay all the salaries, the ministers, and the government, Syrian government's under their control. Turkey is providing the might, the military force, and Turkey and Qatar are very much together in this. Now, Israel was in touch with Qatar from the mid-90s, here and there, not very much, but it's a known fact. But since 2018, that whole issue about Gaza and funding Hamas, because of the economic situation, on and on, this was done by the Israeli government, by Netanyahu. And by the way, those moderate Arab regimes that had broken relations with Qatar and really wanted to eliminate them were very disappointed as such. Yes, there was Israeli direction here because of how Israel viewed the Palestinian Authority. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. Now, Qatar, as we know, has been negotiating hostage deals since October 7th. Okay, just a word about the Israeli policy before we get on to Al Jazeera, right? The idea, Israel, right, the government wanted to have a split Palestinian leadership. And therefore, this is what would happen. You support Hamas, but it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. You never support jihadis. We've said this before. Okay, moving on to Qatari state-owned Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera supports jihad. Now, many of us may be used to the English Al Jazeera, but first we're going to discuss here general and then going into Arabic. The Muslim Brotherhood and Sheikh Yosef Qaradawi, who we discussed before, he's interviewed there all the time and giving sermons castigating the West and talking about jihad. In other words, they host a jihadi. It's like I would say someone would be hosting a Nazi or the Ku Klux Klan. Right? They also support, interview, host in the past Al Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, which, like we said today, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Islamic State Caliphate, and I list them here: Taliban, Hamas, Houthis, and in Arabic, of course, anything goes. You say what you want, you hate everybody, right? Because the whole idea is this Wahhabist understanding, and it's broadcast worldwide in Arabic, meaning that it's under the wire, anybody listening to Al Jazeera in another language, especially in English, where they don't do these types of things because they'll be called on it. Okay. And there are outright calls for jihad. And we know Qaradawi says, finish the Holocaust, get on with it. English Al Jazeera, of course, is sins of omission. So here we have, they also hosted Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal, long interviews. 2011, right? Support the Muslim Brotherhood overthrow, or I shouldn't say overthrow. They got elected, but there was a lot of instability before that in Egypt, and always empowering jihadis wherever they are, in particular Hamas, and the constant anti-Semitism and anti-democratic discussions. Now, sometimes you'd even have Al Qaeda operatives there, being asked about what they want to do and how they're going to do it. And beyond that, the Islamic State Caliphate. So you can see it actually becomes a megaphone for jihad, because remember, this is not just in Qatar and a few Arab states. It's anybody who understands Arabic. And beyond, right, the anti-Semitism, anti-West, it's very clearly anti-Christian and totally against anything democratic. Terror attacks, top of the news, and everybody's praised as martyrs or as great jihadi fighters, and it doesn't matter that they're killing small children. They'll report, just like what happened with Hamas, right? This whole thing about even babies who were killed, that they were arrested. Good. That was what was written on the coffins. Al Jazeera, of course, totally in that direction in Arabic. I don't know if anybody here heard of Samir Kuntar. He was involved in a terrorist attack in Israel in 1979. He was captured. He was released in 2008. He was notorious because he was known that with the terrorist attack, he took a 4-year-old girl and killed her by smashing her head on rocks, the shore line where he came ashore from Lebanon, by Nahariya. All right, it was brutal. When he was freed, Al Jazeera threw a party for him in Lebanon. Al Jazeera sponsored it. Right? Could you imagine that? And as we know, Al Jazeera had been in Israel until April 2024, when they were finally thrown out. And that's after they were continually reporting where Israeli troops are, and there are roadblocks and all sorts of things like that. People were getting quite furious. It's during the war. And finally, the government said, we're revoking their license. Okay, so even in Israel, you would think that would be the most aware. It's like this whole thing, well, freedom of the press, what do you do about it? No, when they're aiding the other side, you throw them out immediately. Okay, Al Jazeera English. And here, they cut corners, they get sticky because, wait a minute, they're trying to appeal to the Western audiences. So what are they doing? Progressive liberationist ideology, right? That whole unity of the Islamists, which we see on campuses today, of course, and your far left, your anarchists, or I even call them, your Stalinist groups, right? And this very much undermines the West. Now, already in 2020, under Trump's last administration, there was government inquiry, Department of Justice, and they said they have to register as a foreign agent because they're not reporting the news. Or they are, but it's so twisted. It's like what they did, I think was called Russia 24. They forced them to register as a foreign agent, not as a news channel. They refused, and as far as I know, they still haven't done it the way they should have. Right? We know that they don't report the side of the West, or in this case, Israel, right, or what goes on with Hamas. And of course, there's no criticism of any of these jihadi organizations. They're very, very much pro-Hezbollah. They would come right up to the border with Israel. And there are times that they've had reporters killed, injured, whatever else. They're not only reporters. A lot of them actually are members of Hamas or Hezbollah, on and on. Now, if anybody ever complains in a live interview against those jihadis that they're supporting, they get cut off. That's always done in Arabic, but they're very careful. In English also, you'll have things where they're shunted aside. As for the Palestinians, of course, they're liberationists, freedom fighters, but the Palestinian Authority has clashed with Al Jazeera. And as far as I recall, unless they've been reinstated, they also got their license suspended there. What is Al Jazeera? It's owned. It's the news media owned by the Qatari emir. Okay, and it's through these dummy companies, but they're the ones in control. It's the state broadcaster, if you want, but projecting outwards to the entire world. And this red-green alliance is very much supported by Al Jazeera, and I put in parentheses, and black. Black meaning Nazism, on and on. Okay, if we take the different colors of ideologies or theologies. It's very much, obviously, against Israel Jews. But remember, what happens first to the Jews happens afterwards to everybody else. Okay, so Al Jazeera and Hamas, to get into it a little more in depth, they had full coordination with Hamas within the global jihad. Hamas is one very small sector. They're fighting Israel, they're fighting the Jews, but that's only a small part of it. Here we have a picture of Mohammed Death, who was a famous terrorist from Hamas. He survived several targeted removals by Israel, and he, in the end, was taken out last summer. Finally. Okay, when he declared war on October 7th with the massacre, who broadcasts it? Where does he get his accolades? You guessed, Al Jazeera. All right, and they just unbelievable amount of praise for him as a great hero and on, but he's orchestrated the massacre. But they're with him. In other words, they're supporting, in my understanding, this is Nazism. And the streaming, right, that live streaming that you had that has been censored in a lot of places, you have to really look carefully for it on the internet. To find it, I found some stuff. It's pretty horrible pictures. That live streaming, hey, uncensored by Al Jazeera, right? And they had their, quote, reporters there as this slaughter and kidnapping of civilians is going on. And they say, no, they're just reporters. And by the way, Israel took some of them out and was condemned by the UN and these other human rights organizations for killing reporters, right? They're right there with those who are murdering and capturing children and slaughtering. Okay, so it's an unofficial Hamas mouthpiece, and I listed here not only with the military, but in every other phase that goes on. And by the way, they reported it in Al Jazeera that Israelis who were abducted, kidnapped, that they were convicted prisoners, right? And of course, denied that Hamas kidnapped civilians at all. All right, so it shows you how depraved this is. And here we have a major news station. Okay, let's take a look at the universities. We call it bribing universities. And the report comes out of the ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Okay, and by the way, there's some very good stuff, extremely well researched. Okay, I'm sure each one of those reports, I'm sure it took months and months to put together. And of course, they're researching anti-Semitism globally, but especially in America. Just to show you, there's a lack of reporting of funding going in, especially from Qatar, right? The research and the scholarships. For instance, Yale, $16 million not reported since 2012. Columbia, we know, is the worst, and we know what goes on there. Over 80 million. Cornell, $10 billion. Why so much? Okay, because they have a hospital in Doha. They work together with Cornell, where medical students study there. And by the way, we know the medical profession has become one of the most anti-Semitic around, and much of it has to do with Qatari monies put into medical schools. Texas A&M. I remember when I went through this, I said, "What? I didn't know Texas A&M was involved." $1 billion, a lot of it nuclear research going on in Qatar. Now let's ask a really stupid question: could any of this have managed to get to the Iranians, being that Qatar and Iran are allies? We'll leave that as an open question. Qatar is the largest national donor to U.S. universities, at least $3 billion. And by the way, we don't know for sure. There could be plenty of other money there as well. One thing is for sure, that where Qatar is involved, those universities are more anti-American and anti-Semitic, some 250% and beyond anti-Semitic incidents on the universities funded by Qatar. The overall picture: corrupting the American mind, once again, a report by the ISAGP. And what they say is all together, okay? In other words, coming from other sources as well. But Qatar is the largest, something like $4.7 billion unreported. Now, that doesn't mean all of it, right, is Qatari, Middle Eastern, or this jihad stuff, but still, there are agendas. What about China? What about other countries that may not have democratic interests, at the top of their list? So Qatar leads, that's for sure. And we find that where they're really involved, dissenting academics. Academics don't agree with them. Try to have their voices heard. They are silenced. They'll try to give a lecture or explain something, and that's where the students come in and break it up. Or breaking up a classroom on Israel studies. That happened, I think, was at Columbia recently. Everything seems to be happening at Columbia. You had some 300% more Israel, more anti-Semitic activity in this just 5-year period that it's here from 15 to 20 in universities where Qatar was involved. So there is a definite connection between anti-Semitism, curtailing free speech, and trying to erode and destroy democracy. And for a country that is that small, and look, the GDP isn't that great, but they can use a lot of it for others, because how much do 350, 60,000 people really need, right? If the GDP is 230 billion and they invest it and make more money in the usual Western way, markets and companies and you name it. So a lot of this is done through the Qatar Investment Authority. And this is where you have the legal covering, and it's a legal, civic, economic, and academic jihad. It's done on every single level. Their investments are between what we were able to track, or I came across researching it, between $500 to $600 billion. But the thinking is there's probably closer to $1 trillion. Can you imagine $1 trillion? A war chest like that? That's anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Christian. And they're the ones who were funding, this is a sideline, funding the South African case, right, in the International Court of Justice against Israel. They say the case is very complicated, very hard to prove. South Africa didn't have money like that. They're putting up the millions for it. And this is through the QIA, as well as Al Jazeera being state-owned as a messaging apparatus. And they're able to use the best high tech for Wahhabist messaging. Once again, let's go back. Imagine the Ku Klux Klan doing this. Imagine Nazis doing it, having that much of a war chest behind them. What havoc they could wreak and the amount of damage done to Western societies, and obviously against Israel, Jewish people. All of this is used in the name of this jihad understanding. And how do they do it? Just gave an example here. A lot of it is just given as support for Palestinian groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and lots of others. You know, Muslim Brotherhood Associated. Oh, we just gave some money. It's a civic group. Okay, so that's where we are. We have to deal with this academic civic jihad. And of course, we've got Colombia here. Palestinian nationalism, right? That's the cover for jihad. If it was Palestinian nationalism on a secular level, discuss a two-state solution, discuss everything without the hatred, how did this come about, really get into the history, back and forth. No, obviously not. The whole objective there is destruction of Israel and, of course, Jews who are on the front lines of absorbing this anti-Semitism. All right. As we said before, I don't need to go over it again, right? It's Colombia that's the worst, and everything we spoke about with this alliance. And yes, building cells, right? You can imagine to destroy what's called empire. Empire meaning United States, right? Destroying empire. And there are clips about it, where they talk empire and they never speak about democracy, right? Just that they're going to be on top and they're going to control. And they do it in this red, green, black Nazi alliance. Okay, so where we go with all this? Because you say, okay, that sounds pretty terrible. Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you it gets worse. You have what's known as the ISIS system of concentric circles. And I wrote sponsored by Qatar originally without a question mark, but I figured I better put one in. All right, just in case. We have a picture on the left-hand side, Musa al-Suri with bin Laden. Now, just to understand Musa al-Suri a bit, this picture is from Afghanistan, but he had a break with bin Laden because he considered them too soft. He also didn't like the whole thing with the 9/11 attacks because his perspective was, wait a minute, why are you waking up the West, especially the Christians? Like the Jews are onto us, we know, but they don't count for very much. And you woke them up, and yeah, you had the American response invading Afghanistan, on and on. What was his perspective is that you have to have a global Islamic resistance, and he wrote about this, put it online, 2004, 3 years after 9/11, where you form cells all over, but everything's done in a digital manner, right? And there will be this, in the end, terror, brutality, just like what happened to the Islamic State. He's really considered the architect of it. By the way, he was arrested and shipped off to Syria and disappeared in 2005, right? But that you have to destroy your enemies both near and far. Near, those are the Arab regimes that are, considered to be pro-West, even if they're obviously not democracies. But the far enemies, that's what he's talking about, everybody else. The West, the Jews, right? Anyone who's not jihadi. And he explains that this is a system and not an organization. Recall a reference to methodology. What does that mean? That you cannot follow the line, right? If you get a digital jihad, someone's given instructions on how to make a bomb or given instructions to go attack someplace. If that person gets caught, who are they going to implicate? There's nobody to implicate, but it's a whole system and it's a whole understanding. And what do they want in the end? They make it very clear. There are 3 steps. 1, establish the caliphate, just like the Islamic State did. They conquered territory where the area was most chaotic and non-governed, right? We're talking about Eastern Syria, Western Iraq. This began some 15, 20 years ago. The height of the caliphate was 2014, 15, and then eventually they lost in battles to many different partners in this entire operation, whether it be America, Russia, Syrians, Iraqis, doesn't matter. Even the Iranians and Hezbollah, they were outnumbered about 20-1, and that's how they ended up losing. But what he says is you capture these areas, and then you have an open front jihad. Okay, everything's open and you work that way. Now, once you've captured these areas and you've done it through brutality, there's chaos, you bring in a very harsh regime, they're so brutal nobody even thinks to have an uprising against them, you solidify this caliphate. The minute that's done, you start sending out your caliphate fighters, many of whom are foreigners, came to you, they know different foreign languages, and they go back to their home countries and become the nucleus of the new jihad, and they spread the word. They'll take action when told to. Third, the digital part of it. You have terror cells formed, but no hierarchy. In other words, sleeper cells. But once again, as I explained before, you don't know who's running them. And therefore, they're untraceable. And at the moment you give the order, they can all attack. And the caliphate also will expand. That is what we're looking at. Now, why did I write sponsored by Qatar? If Qatar is sponsoring all these Wahhabist ideas and it's sinking in, so Musab al-Suri's, how should we say, his henchmen, even though he's not around anymore, but those who absorb this idea, right, they'll be there and they will then catch in their nets those who already were leading in this direction, because they're supposed to identify them. And of course, could have a massive uprising, well coordinated, done through internet frameworks. Okay, that's what that's what we're up against. That's what we have to battle against, right? The civic academic jihad, no less dangerous than that on the battlefield.